Okay, so I think we'll make a start to tonight's event. A very warm welcome to everybody who's joined us tonight. Thank you very much for giving up your time. And at least tonight we're not competing with the sunshine outside. Tonight it's a bit chilly and a bit cloudy, so what better way to spend the evening than joining us for this lecture. My name is Paula Harrison and I'm the coordinator at University Centre Telford, and we're hosting this event tonight. Normally we would have our public lecture programme in the centre, and we run a range of events throughout the year, but obviously unfortunately because of the current situation we have moved a lot of our lectures online. And we've been delighted that so many of our academic staff have offered to join us, and they've offered lots of really interesting lectures. So tonight we have Dr. Kay Biscomb and Dr. Kathryn Leflay joining us, and I'll give you a bit more information about their backgrounds and the talk in a moment. So a very warm welcome to them as well, and thank you very much for their time tonight. Just to go through a couple of practical things, the Q&A icon is, if you're on your desktop on Zoom, is at the bottom on the screen, and Kath and Kay will be taking questions at the end of the lecture. Ideally this would have been an interactive seminar, but obviously this is the way that we can take questions on Zoom. If you're on a mobile device, the icon is in the top right-hand corner. Post your questions throughout the talk, and then I can ask Kay and Kath the questions at the end. So I hope that's okay. Tonight's lecture has a very intriguing title, Long Blonde Hair and Endless Legs, a different way to read the sports pages. Kay is a Director of Business Excellence at the university. She joined in 1996 and then, since then has been Head of Department and Associate Dean. Her research interests are media representation, equality and identity issues in sport, so hence the lecture tonight. And Dr. Kathryn Leflay is a Principal Lecturer in the Faculty of Education, Health and Wellbeing, which is where sport sits at the university. She's also a member of the teaching team for the BA Honours in Sport Business Management, and Kath's research interests sit within both sports sociology and teaching and learning. And again, obviously that's the reason why she's with us tonight. So if I can hand over to you, Kay, to start the lecture. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Paula, for that great introduction. And thank you everyone for being here and taking part. I'd love to say it's lovely to see you all, but the reality is I actually can't see you. I'm hoping that you can see Kath and I. And thank you for inviting us into your homes in these strange times. You know about me, Paul has told you about me, you know about Kath. I'd just like to point out that because obviously I started at the university in 1996. I was only 10 when I started, so obviously we'll be able to place that. But since that time, we've actually been doing research in print media, and the kind of overview that we're going to give you tonight is looking at some of those research articles that we've published and some of the findings that we've produced. And we're hoping that we'll be able to share with you some of those things that we think are interesting. We're going to share the presentation between us. I'm starting off, but Kath and I will be interjecting throughout. And so you'll see when we switch places. But obviously you can see my colleague Kath, and I'm delighted that we're doing this session together. We did ask you to bring an article with you, and I don't want you to worry. We're not going to be asking Edwina from Carlisle what her thoughts are on this matter. We're just going to be asking you to think about your article and reflect on what's in your article at various times during the session. But don't worry, you're not going to have to discuss with your neighbour who happens to be in the box next to you or anything like that. But it's interesting, isn't it, that having asked you to do that, you then look at the sports pages if you have looked at a print media edition, and there's actually not an awful lot in those sport pages because there's not an awful lot that's actually ongoing or indeed being reported. So, long blonde hair and endless legs reported in the Daily Mail on the 2nd of July. And I've chosen this particular quote to illustrate our title because it's quite a sexist quote that illustrates some of the things that we're going to talk about through our seminar. And we're going to look at 3 themes this evening. The first theme is going to be about gender and reporting and how print media has looked at those issues between male and female athletes. We're then going to move on to a particular study that was based on the Summer of Sport in 2017 and some of the really interesting things that we found at that time. And then lastly, we're going to look at some of the impact that football and the development of football in this country has had on cricket reporting. And we might pause at a particular point to see if there's any questions that you have then. Paul has given you the indication as to where the chat is so that you can put those Q&A in. So the work that we're sharing with you is work that, as I said, has been ongoing since '96 and actually covers quite a number of different studies. One is a longitudinal study that we started in '96 and is still ongoing, but the others are shorter studies, and you can see there are co-researchers that have worked with us on those studies, and obviously a big part of the work that we're presenting with you tonight. So to start off, the first thing I'd say to you is look at the article that you've got. Have you brought with you a print version or have you got a digital version? Because when we started this research, there was only a print version possible. But now, obviously, if researchers were to start on a similar project, they would have that choice. Should I look at print or should I look at digital or should I look at both? But if you wanted to measure space, because that's one of the things that we have done, then realistically, you'd probably only choose a print version to do that. So I'd say to you, if you've got a digital version and you wanted to measure space, how would you be able to do that? And what would be the ways that you'd be able to do that? In the article that you've brought, have a look at the title, the layout of the article, and has it got any photos in there or not? Do you know who's written the article? Is the journalist's name published? Sometimes it is, but very often it's not. Which paper was it published in? Because these are all the sorts of things that over the years we've looked at and have formed part of the research that we're sharing with you. So at this point, I'm now going to hand over to Kath, who's going to give you an overview of the context of some of the research in this area.
Thanks, Kate. So before we go into the specifics of particular research projects and their findings, we just really wanted to spend a few minutes setting the scene around gender reporting and to highlight some of the themes that have emerged in previous literature. And what you'll see over the seminar this evening is that we will revisit some of those and add a few more in as we go. Have the next slide, please, Kay. So our studies, I think before we start, it's important to acknowledge that the studies that we're going to be sharing with you this evening fit into an already established area of research. The academic interest in gender media reporting took off in the mid-1980s, and it's still a popular area of research today. So studies focus on a number of different aspects of reporting. So some of those studies focus on the amount, as Kay mentioned earlier, the amount of reporting of female athletes compared to males. Others examine what type of coverage is prevalent and what themes emerge in that reporting. And another set of studies focus on what's changed in the amount or style of reporting over a particular period of time. And I know that's going to be something that Kay picks up on when she talks about one particular study. Although it isn't really the focus of the seminar this evening, I think it's also important to acknowledge at this point that this area of research is also now expanding to consider social media. and that is possibly the direction of travel of where this area is going to expand in the future. So to pick up on the first theme, if you think back to the title that Kay gave you at the beginning, we might consider that to be representative of a sexualisation of female athletes. And these themes can emerge either based on the words that are used, but also the images that are selected. So if you have a look at the image at the top right of your screen, this would be an example of sexualisation of a female athlete. And this is a particularly prominent theme within earlier studies within this research area. And we would consider it to be an issue because it takes away from the female athletes, it detracts from the female athletes' achievements. The focus on the physical appearance of the female athlete rather than athletic ability sends out the message that a female is only worth reporting on if they're conventionally feminine and beautiful. Another trend within print media reporting is that comparisons of athletes. And in their work on college basketball in the United States, Kiana Tell in 2008 commented that it seems impossible to discuss women's sport without discussing men. And I thought that statement really captured the theme very well. The image in the top left of your screen is Fran Kirby, so one of the England football players, who's been dubbed Mini Messi by the media, both for her playing style and goal scoring ability. And although it could be argued that being compared to one of the top players in the world is hugely flattering and highlighting the skills of a female player, what it's also implying is that her skill set can't be understood and appreciated without a male for a frame of reference. And it's also notable that we don't see that trend reversed in the coverage of men's sport. Reference to male support is another theme prevalent within media coverage, and fathers and brothers features quite prominently within that. An example here, so the bottom left of your screen, is Tracy Neville, and who in her role as head coach successfully led the England team in 2018 to Commonwealth gold and last year to World Cup bronze. And despite the success at an international level, her well-known brothers are often referenced in stories of her success. She's first and foremost the sister of Gary and Phil Neville. And her brothers are also interestingly credited with the socialisation that led to her success. So growing up in a competitive environment with boys, serving as good preparation for her role as a coach. The sort of fourth and final thing that I'm going to talk about on this slide is reference to other roles that the female athlete has, for example, being a mother or a wife. And this serves a function of emphasising the femininity and also the heterosexuality of the athlete. So with this example, upon her return to tennis after giving birth, Serena Williams' partner and baby were often featured and included in stories of the player's progress within the tournament. And what that was doing is that was effectively reminding the reader that this athlete, she's a mother now as well as an athlete. And sticking with the same sport, we do see the wives and partners of male players watching in the stands, particularly when we watch tennis on TV and the camera frequently pans to them. But this tends to be framed in such a way as the female partner or wife being there in a supportive role and cheering on their man, rather than taking away from the coverage of the male player's performance. So this was never designed really to be an exhaustive list of themes, but really just hopefully give you a flavour of the research in which our studies sit. So the newspapers that you can see featured on this slide are the papers that we use for data collection over the various studies that we're going to discuss this evening. And what you'll notice is that this selection covers a range of tabloid and broadsheet papers. And as we draw on data from our studies, one of the things that you might want to consider and take note of is which paper that they've been taken from, and start to note some of the patterns or differences between the quotes that you see from the different newspapers.
Moving on.
Yes, please.
Okay. So I'm going to pick up this one. And this shows you some of the data from the longitudinal study. So the longitudinal study, we collected data from 1984 and looked at 2 weeks in 1984. We compared it to the same 2 weeks in 1994, the same 2 weeks in 2004, and the same 2 weeks in 2014. And we were interested to see how trends have changed over that period of time. And you'll see from this particular figure that this shows you the amount of total newspaper coverage, and of that total, how much was devoted to sport. And we can see two trends in here. We can see that newspaper coverage has increased, and also the amount of space that was given over to sport has increased as well. We can see, therefore, that newsprint, sport in newsprint is expanding. But one of the things that we noticed in the midpoint of this data collection is that the way that newspapers were being printed has changed because of the introduction of desktop publishing. And therefore, we had to consider ways that we were measuring, and how do you measure that, which is the question that I started with earlier and asked you earlier. So as part of our study, we looked at measuring the quantitative data. So that's looking at numbers and how much space was devoted to reporting. And also we looked at qualitative data. So in other words, what was the content of the reports and what might we see in those reports? And we did that both quantitative and qualitative for the longitudinal study. But the other studies that we talk about this evening, which are the shorter studies, we've only really looked at the qualitative data rather than the quantitative data. For the quantitative data set, which is in this longitudinal study, we made choices in 1996 about how we would measure that coverage, so how we'd go back to 84 to measure it, so that we could talk about proportional coverage, so that we could say how much space is given over to male and female representation. And because of those later changes, we then had to make some changes to our original design in order to make some comparisons. In the longitudinal study, we've been very interested to see how men and women appear differently in the reporting. This particular figure shows you about total reporting, and I'll move on now to some of the qualitative data from that study. So in this table, what you'll see are examples of appearance reporting, and you can see some examples from 84, 94, 2004 and 2014. And the reason why appearance has been chosen for something to talk about and emphasize with you tonight is because that's one of the real trends and themes that appears in this area of research, because we can see that particularly at the early part of the study, there was a real emphasis on reporting female athletes based on how they look. For example, the pertly attractive comment from the Telegraph and the baby doll blonde comment from the Guardian, both appearing as examples from 1984 as typical of the kinds of ways that female athletes were reported at that time. But the longitudinal data shows us over this period of time that there is a shift, and that by 2014, what we see is that there's less of an emphasis on describing a female athlete in terms of what she looks like, but actually it becomes more about how she performs. And that 2014 example that we've got there, which is the quote about Michelle Wee, really stands out in 2014 in the data set because it was so different in contrast to the other styles of reporting that we saw at the time. If you also look at that 2004 example from the Express about Sharapova, there's a reference there to performance first and achievement first. And I would say with an implicit suggestion that actually it's therefore okay to refer to this athlete, this top class athlete, as eye candy. We now move on to looking at some examples of performance reporting, again from this longitudinal data set. And during this time period, we see that there's a shift towards more reporting on the performance of the athletes. In the early phases, we see that the reporting of performance is often negatively balanced. So you might get some negative performance reported, but as it shifts towards 2014, it becomes much more framed in positive reporting, which again, we would see as a real positive in the way that things have changed. One of the other trends that we see that occurs during this time period is that there's a use of direct quotation that you don't see in the 80s, but by 2014 is quite a common way of reporting about sport by using direct quotes from players or coaches. And it's also a trend that we noted in the 2009 study on World Cricket. Another trend that we've seen in the reporting of performance is that, particularly in tennis, this appears more in tennis than in any other sport, that a story as written in the print newspaper can be framed as either the victory of one athlete or alternatively is framed as the defeat of an athlete. And journalists are obviously making decisions as to how to frame those stories. We also see this shift in how there's an emphasis on performance appearing in the work that we did on Teresa Bennett. Teresa Bennett was a 12-year-old schoolgirl who legally challenged the FA in 1978 for the right to play in an under-12s football team. Her original challenge was successful, but then was revoked on appeal 6 weeks later. In 2007, Minnie Crutwell became a focus of the Department for Culture, Media and Sport Select Committee on Women's Football and prompted a further re-evaluation into mixed football. And what we saw that was typical of the way that those two stories were framed. In 1978, Teresa Bennett was often portrayed in the media in very passive poses, like the one that we've seen here on this image. Whereas in contrast, in 2007, the imagery that accompanied the Minnie Crutwell example was actually much more active and showing Minnie in an active role. And that was, again, mirroring some of these trends that we see. One of the last examples that we'd like to draw out from this longitudinal data set for you is the way that nationality is reported during this time. In the literature, you will see that nationality is currently a very contemporary theme that is reported about right across sports sociology. But you'll notice from the table that there are no examples from 1984. It wasn't a trend that we saw. But in 1994, you see this reference to somebody of Australia or somebody of Romania. But by the time we get to 2014, the nationality is then being used as an adjective and is much more commonly integrated throughout all types of reporting. So the question I would ask you to reflect upon as you look at your article is, are there examples of nationality reporting in your article? Can you see examples of where performance is written about? Are there any examples of where appearance is written about in any of your athletes? So those are some of the major themes that we saw from the longitudinal data set, with a bit of reference to some of the shorter studies. And you'll notice that I haven't made reference to how much was reported. And to be honest with you, that's actually not a great story, because how much is reported in 2014 differs very little to how much was reported in 1984 for female athletes. Remember, that's about female athletes. So that kind of gives you a flavour to some of the gendered aspect of reporting. So I'm now going to hand over to Kath, and hopefully I won't have any technical difficulties in this section, and I won't be kicked out of Zoom or kicked off the internet, but I'm going to hand over to Kath, who's going to share with you one of our shorter studies about 2017. Or I'm not, because it might have frozen. Oh, there we go, I've got that.
Thanks, Kay. So in the following section, I'm going to be sharing some of the key findings from a research project entitled England's Summer of Sport, which we've recently had a paper published in the journal called Sport in Society. Have the next slide, please, Kay. And just really to set the scene with this, 2017 was a unique year for sport, with 4 of these tournaments taking place, as you can see here, in a few over a period of a few months over the summer. And this was actually the first time in history that these 4 tournaments had been played in the same year. All of these teams succeeded within their respective tournaments. So with England hockey and football teams reaching the semi-finals, and then both teams achieving 3rd place in the playoffs. Rugby team were runners-up in the World Cup final, and the cricket team went one better, actually winning the World Cup cricket, winning the Cricket World Cup. And one of the things that we were particularly interested in looking at these 4 tournaments together, really, was the cumulative effect of the tournaments on the way that female performers were represented. And whilst previous research has focused on major tournaments, this has tended to look at those in isolation. And we wanted to find out 2 things. The first thing was whether the prevalence of English women's sport coverage in 2017 had a positive influence on trends in representation. And the second thing was whether the relative success of English women's teams over the summer resulted in the players being framed as authentic athletes. And for the purpose of this particular study, we considered the representation of female athletes as authentic as being characterised by a focus on and celebration of athletic competence and accomplishment rather than objectification and sexualisation. Can I have the next slide, please, Kay? This table that you can see here highlights the number of articles that were generated through our search of 4 national newspapers. And you can see here the newspapers that we used. And we accessed these newspapers using an electronic database called ProQuest. And as part of searching for articles, we used predetermined search terms, and they included popular terms that have been coined popular in the media for teams. For example, the Red Roses in rugby and the Lionesses in football. And it's notable from this as well that you'll see that the interest in hockey lags quite significantly behind the other tournaments. And we thought that this maybe reflects the status of hockey as a popular spectator sport as much as it does gender. Can I have the next slide, please, Kay? So the first of our themes within this particular paper, the first one is international success. And this was a key theme in the coverage of all the tournaments. And what was particularly interesting for us with this was that reference was frequently made to success across the tournaments in order to highlight the overall achievements that had been made over the summer. And the top quote that you can see on here is a typical example of this. We anticipated that the expectation of success, as well as the success achieved within the tournaments, might play a part in the way that teams and individuals were reported upon. And there was expectation on all of these teams based on previous successes. The celebratory nature of successes of the national team isn't anything new within this area of research. A previous study by Quinn et al. In 2010 referred to something they called a contextual effect. And they suggested that consisted of the combination of the context of a major tournament, the medal effect, so how far a team progressed, and the national effect, which relates to playing for the national team. And what they suggested is when the combination of these factors come together, journalists are likely to focus on their athletes more than anything else. So it might therefore be assumed that the contextual effect allows for females to be treated as legitimate athletes. In order to further legitimise the success of the women's teams, reports included reference to other significant years for English and British sport. And this was done really to provide clearly understandable benchmarks of success to be interpreted by the audience. So even those people who aren't familiar with women's sport could start to see that, you know, this was a really fantastic year for the achievements that had been made. An example of this is the second quote down, with reference being made to the Men's World Cup win in 1966, and also the hosting of London 2012. Women's sport has faced significant challenges in terms of gaining media coverage, with media coverage being a key factor for raising the profile and standard of professional sport. And the style of media reporting appeared on a number of occasions to demonstrate a level of self-awareness regarding their own role in promoting women's sport. So articles place an emphasis on sell-out crowds, impressive viewing figures, to show that there is actually an appetite for women's sport if you show it. And this is really significant because it's the claim that there is no appetite for women's sport that has frequently been used to justify a lack of investment from sponsors and a lack of coverage within the media. Comparison to men's sport appeared within the reporting. So I mentioned that earlier in one of the themes that quite frequently crops up. But for the most part within this particular study, the emphasis was actually to emphasise the positives of the women's game. One article, for example, stated, "It's been the subject of much heartfelt debate in recent years, how to make women's sport as popular with fans as the men's. But this summer, British sportswomen have provided their own glaringly straightforward solution by being more successful than their male counterparts." And the third quote down you can see on the slide also illustrates that. And although they are quite feel-good, they're championing the success of women's teams, they're perhaps quite naive in the suggestion that simply being successful is enough to affect any significant changes. Have the next slide, please, Kay. As part of the media self-awareness trend that I mentioned previously, there were also articles that were very critical of sport governing bodies and federations for their failings in promoting equality across women and men's sport. And over the summer, there was particular criticism was levelled at the Rugby Football Union for their announcement that they were going to withdraw player contracts at the end of the World Cup. So the fact that the players who had just led England to the final of the World Cup would soon be forced to return to the amateur ranks, it provided a stark reminder of the precarious realities of women's professional sport. And there were clear implications for this decision. So most notably, the decision to withdraw contracts is likely to limit the ability to retain quality players, leading to a decline in the standard of the sport. And the knock-on effect of that is this in turn is likely to reduce opportunities to attract media coverage and sponsorship. So it's a real vicious circle for women's sports in that sense. Now the next slide, please, Kay. The media were also critical of MCC members who were notable by their absence during the Cricket World Cup final at Lord's. The decision of members not to attend was seen as a reflection of the lack of support for the women's game at organisational level. And the implicit message by these members not attending is that the women's game, even a World Cup final, isn't worth turning out for. Can I have the next slide, please? The second theme from our study relates to performance of both individual players and teams. And across all 4 sports, there are numerous examples of females being celebrated for individual outstanding sporting performances. And with a focus on performance rather than appearance or commentary about their personal lives, it appeared that the players were being treated first and foremost as athletes. Comments from coaches and players were often used to offer an insider perspective, sharing thoughts on team and individual performances. Litchfield and Kathryne in 2019 referred to the increased presence of first-hand accounts from female athletes as our voice. And they cite that this is a trend that's indicative of increasing influence and power to shape media. Throughout the summer of sport, female athletes were regularly quoted commenting on the positive performances of their teammates and overall team performances. And in a sports media industry that's been very much dominated by male journalists, the inclusion of female athletes' voices can be considered significant, and that it's another indication that female athletes are being taken seriously and that they're also being considered a legitimate authority on their sport. Reporting on this theme focused on both physical and psychological aspects of performance, and you can see the top two quotes on this slide are typical of the way that player performance was discussed. The number of goals, runs and tries provides easily understandable markers of a successful performance. But the praise went further beyond that to encompass the skills and qualities of individual players, and reference was made to future stars or a future captain of England, which is talking very positively about the players. The reference to the emotional resilience of teams and individual players, certainly for me, was a standout feature across reporting. In other research in this area, women have been portrayed as emotionally weak. That's particularly in some of the earlier studies in this area. And because they're emotionally weak, not really cut out for the rigours of sport. Over the summer of sport, there was constant reference to mental toughness, teams and players holding their nerves under pressure and demonstrating their ability to step up when required. So very much distant from the previous studies where emotional weakness has been prevalent. Can I have the next slide, please, Kate? Although it was a much smaller part of the reporting than celebratory accounts, there were instances where player performances were singled out for ridicule, and this is a really standout example of that, both within the title and some of the quotes here from the main piece of the article. In what appears to be an attempt to be deliberately derogatory and provocative, a female player's performance is compared to a county male player, and the standard of the game overall compared to a pub match on a village green. So hardly flattering comparisons. And it's important to note that although there were examples of this, they were few and far between and very much overshadowed by the positive coverage that we saw. Now the next slide, please. The final theme within our study was role models, and sporting role models have long been considered inspirational figures for young people. Although with the sporting landscape being traditionally dominated by men's sport, girls have had a lack of high-profile female athletes to draw inspiration from. Media reports over the summer of sport suggested that this was something that was about to change. Female athletes from all of the sports were discussed positively in terms of the traits they displayed both on and off the pitch, making them ideal role models for young people. Reporters discussed the inspirational effect of tournaments on their own daughters, and in particular, the fact that it had opened their eyes to a possibility of a cool career in professional sport. The desire to become a professional athlete was explained by the reporters as being linked to having the opportunity to perform at the top level in front of large crowds. Through being exposed to the coverage of women's sport, where skill and athleticism is celebrated, young girls are aspiring to be like the female athletes that they see on TV. Of significance here is the idea that players are being looked up to because of what they do rather than what they look like. Players were also conscious of their own role in raising the profile of the game. And they saw themselves as doing this in two ways. One of those ways was to be successful, to win medals, to win trophies. But the other way was through connecting with fans. And the second quote really reflects that, the connection with fans. There was also a real desire to inspire young people to take part in sport. As Natasha Hunt, one of the rugby players, states here, every time you want to put on this shirt, every time you put on this shirt, you want to inspire. So really just to provide a few conclusions that we came to from this paper before I hand back over to Kay. For the most part, traditional belittling strategies were neglected in favour of approaches that celebrated and recognised athletic achievement. Athletes were framed as authentic, and their successes and athletic achievements were very much recognised, and they weren't on the whole diluted There's a few exceptions, but they were very much buried within this real positive media coverage. Clear reference was made to things like sellout crowds and impressive media audiences. And another more subtle measure of success is what I've just been talking about, is the framing of female players as role models, particularly for young girls. And I think, Kay, we wanted to sort of pause at this point, didn't we, just to see if there are any questions, if that's okay, Paula?
There haven't been any questions so far, no.
That's okay, we can pick them up at the end.
Okay, yeah, that's fine. Thank you.
Okay, so I will pull out our third and final theme then. And as Paul has just mentioned, there'll be an opportunity for questions. If you've got any questions, you can ask them when we finish this last theme. And what we wanted to share with you was just something that actually emerged, particularly through the 2004 data set, which obviously we've then followed on, and was actually the impact that football reporting has on male cricket coverage. So one of the things that we've been able to do in the longitudinal study is look at how different sports are reported differentially. And you'll see that the light blue bar is the cricket reporting, and the black bar is the football reporting. And you can see that by 84, 94, 2004 and 2014. This particular set of data does include all reporting. So it's men's, women's and both. But the reality of that in cricket and football is that that is mainly men's data, because there's so little of cricket reporting in those early years, in 1984, when there's a lot of it. And there's actually no football reporting in 2014, which is a real surprise, because you've got the Women's Super League that has emerged by that date. You would expect to see seasonal differences in reporting because of the seasonal sports that we see. But what we actually see in this longitudinal set of data is the impact of the rise of the Premier League on the reporting of cricket. So if we make a comparison on this slide, this line down shows you the trajectory of cricket reporting that occurs from 1984 to 2014. And really interestingly, by contrast, I didn't see my black arrow, but there was a black arrow that shows you that trajectory up from the increase in football reporting. There it is, it's disappeared. So one of the questions I would encourage you to look at your particular article is, are you seeing anything in your article that might reflect seasonal reporting, or is there anything in that that is just unusual or interesting? You'll see that in 2004, we get quite a strange impact there on athletics. So there's a real big difference on athletics here. And the reason for that is because 2004 was an Olympic year. So one of the things that we did with this longitudinal data set is we tried to look at what were the interesting things that were occurring in and around these 2-week periods, so that we could see, is there anything here that's going to influence that data set? And we were particularly convinced that the start of the British Premier League in football was one of the key reasons for the change in that quantitative data. One of the things that we then noticed in the qualitative data is that there was a real interest in how contracts were reported, particularly around football. And you can see some examples of this reporting demonstrated here. But the relationship between footballers and their contractual position hasn't been a strong focus for the other sports, and in particular cricket and men's cricket. Commercial interest in football business has increased, and we think that this commercial interest has spread into the national press and how that is therefore portrayed. We can see that through some of these things, there is a commodification of the player and therefore economic drivers being the point for decision making. Sport is not only now a major industry in its own right, but one which contributes to the health of other major industries, such as media and advertising. And professional athletes can be said to occupy a particular position in sport and society, with the rewards gained hugely outweighing those gained by other participants. So again, in your article, are there particular references to contracts or maybe references to the athletes or players that might indicate a commodification of that individual? So that concludes the third theme that we were going to look at today. So I'm going to just hand over to Kath, who's going to give you some of those takeaway messages to summarise before we move on to questions.
Thanks, Kay. So I'm just going to finish off by drawing together some of the key points from the presentation. And like I said, also some things to take away and think about when you're reading your articles now or at a later time. So some of the things that we've discussed tonight, the way in which women's sport is reported on is shifting away from sexualisation and towards acknowledging athletic ability. And that was shown in a couple of the studies that we shared with you this evening. In more recent work, the media appear to be taking on the role of championing women's sport, so highlighting the successes and the positive performances of teams and players. And perhaps more importantly, raising awareness about inequality with regard to issues such as player salary, contracts, and lack of support from governing bodies. Although, at this stage, with this being a relatively new trend, it's not all that easy to see what the impact of this style of reporting is in terms of actions that are being taken. And rather than seeing extremely overt negative coverage as often cited in earlier work, we're starting to see a greater degree of ambivalence in reporting style, where women's sport is simultaneously celebrated and devalued, sometimes within the same article. One of the things that we've also noted is how much is reported on women's sport needs more work. So even for major games, the articles were considered to be very low, and that was particularly for the summer of sport. That was when four major tournaments were taking place. So you can only imagine what that situation would be if there were no tournaments taking place. So some things to consider when reading your articles. Ask yourself, is there a different way that this story could be told? And a follow-on from that really is, what are the implications of telling this story in a particular way? And has the journalist used any of the techniques that we've described today? And if so, why do you think they have? And we hope that some of the strategies that have been used will help you to start to think about how you read sport in a different light. So thank you for joining us this evening, and I'd like to hand over to Paula for any questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Kath and Kay. That was absolutely fascinating. Really enjoyed that. And there's been a flurry of questions, so I'll start reading those out for you. So the first question comes from Lynn, and she says, as a news journalist herself, she's wondered how her gender affects what she writes about and how she writes it. In your research, have you looked at the gender of the sports reporters?
Do you want me to pick that one up then, Kath? I can, thanks very much for your question, Lynn. It's a really interesting one. I can confirm that there are a few studies within the literature base where the researcher has considered the gender of the journalist, but it's not something that we've looked at ourselves. Part of that is because the longitudinal study is a huge data set in its own right, and we've really only just begun to kind of look at some of the real key and the top line of it. There's loads more analysis that could be done from that particular data set, but we've never actually looked at it ourselves. My gut reaction to your question would be that, yes, I think it probably does make a difference and will impact on the way that journalists write. But as I said, I'm pretty confident there's at least 2 studies in the literature that has done that, but it's not our own work.
Okay, thank you very much. And the next one is more of a comment than a question. And it's from Denise, and she says it's been refreshing to see female players and former players being included in the commentary and amongst the pundits in TV coverage of men's football and rugby matches. Men have always commentated on women's matches in all sports, but the reverse has been a long time coming.
Thanks, Denise. Yeah, I would agree with that. And we've got some really, I think when you particularly when you watch televised sport, we've got some excellent commentators who have done the ranks in their field and in their sport, but now making a tremendous contribution in terms of journalism. And, you know, I'll remind some of our older members of the audience, Helen Rollason, who at the Sunday Times, well, it's probably not sponsored by the Sunday Times, but the Sportswoman of the Year award. There used to be a Helen Rollason award for, you know, standing out in your field. And that name stands out because at the time when Helen was the BBC journalist for sport, you know, she was very much on her own, but obviously now we've got lots and lots of really fantastic role models and examples. I don't know if Kath wants to add any comment to that.
I think the nice thing now is as well, you don't feel it's tokenistic. You feel that they are actually, you know, that they are there, they've been selected on the basis of their knowledge, and that they are able to, you know, to challenge the men's opinion within that environment as well. And I think that's really nice to see, because I think having somebody in there that's just there to tick a box is a very different thing from having somebody who is genuinely there and contributing as well.
Okay, thank you. And the next question comes from Fiona. She says, hi there, really enjoying your insights. Just wondered what kind of things have you, what kind of things you might have been noticing about the impacts of COVID on reporting on women's sport?
I'll start. Kath might want to follow on. I've not noticed much on the impact on women, but I have noticed the impact on sport. And that is, at the moment, there's just very little of it because there's very little to talk about. So when you open up, I read The Guardian, when I open up my Guardian on a Saturday to read the sports pages, there might be 3 or 4, and they're actually having to almost generate stories because there's no live action to report on. So that would be my comment on the impact of COVID, but I think it's a really interesting one, and maybe we need to do a new study, Kath.
Okay, thank you. And then there's a final question from Ali. Oh no, and another one has just come in. How fundamental do you think the print media are in relation to increasing the appetite of the general public to engage with women's sport?
I'll start that one if you want. Okay, I think all of the media, all different forms of media are absolutely fundamental, and I think it's that consistency across as well. I think, you know, so social media has represented a new era, really, a new opportunity for women's sport, for example, because it means that players can be on there, if you like, on their own terms, and they don't have to be as led. If we think about the traditional media reporting, it's seen as being very much led by the media deciding on how females are reported on. Whereas now there is an alternative channel where females can choose how they represent themselves through that social media. But I think, you know, certainly, you know, one of the things that we noticed in the Summer of Sport paper that we wrote was very much around that the media do seem to be really embracing that opportunity to champion women's sport, and to really celebrate and to really pick up on positive performances. And it was the performances. There was, out of everything that we looked at, if you compare it to some of the comments that Kay made about some of the earlier, the representation, is it in 1984, Kay, your earlier study?
Yeah.
There was only one reference, and it was only a very, you would class it as very covert reference to sexualisation. So I think the fact that the media now are taking women's sport seriously, and also this idea that if you put it on, people actually are interested and do want to watch it. So I think, you know, that the more media coverage that can get out there and demonstrate that there's an audience for that is only really positive for women's sport. And the knock-on effect then, if you get the media coverage, you get the sponsorship, and you start to professionalise the game. So all of these things, that they're all interlinked.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much. And then we've got a final question from Mary, who says, great presentation, thank you very much. Is there a trend towards comments about emotions and women's reactions linked to emotions rather than appearance? I notice this particularly in commentators' reflections on how female players are reacting during a tennis match in particular.
Yes, we saw that quite clearly in the longitudinal data set, and whilst it has a less emphasis in the latest data set, I would say that it is something that is throughout all of the reporting. So yes, you do see it in print media as well. Mm-hmm. But as Kath said, in the Summer of Sport work, there was quite a lot of emphasis on kind of the more positive side of the emotion, in that steely, determined side of the emotions came out in that data set, didn't it, Kath?
Yeah, and I think that in some of the early reporting as well, that you see a real difference. So men can be portrayed as emotional, but that is classed as being very much dedicated to their sport, and it's about passion. Whereas with women, the emotional, particularly crying, was seen as being weak. Whereas in the Summer of Sport, emotion was very much picked up on, but it was that real, that this is very much gritty performances. It's teams pulling together. It's individuals who are showing a great deal of emotional resilience. So there was a real, that was actually probably from the Summer of Sport. That was one of the biggest things that stood out for me, because that was so prevalent within a lot of the media reporting, and I had never seen that much before.
Interesting. Thank you very much. That's all the questions that have come up. So thank you very much for answering those. And if there isn't anything else, I'm just checking to see if there's anybody else posting. I don't think there is. So I'd just like to say thank you very much to Kath and Kay for tonight's lecture. It was absolutely fascinating, thoroughly enjoyable. And we've got another few sports lectures coming up in the same format. Next week, same place, same time, we've got Coaching in an Uncertain Climate. Another great title, Making Lemonade Out of Lemons. And that's by Dr. Sean Galloway, who work alongside Kath and Kay. That's live streaming as well. And then we've got Sport in a Time of Crisis by Professor Jean Williams. That's coming up on the 16th of June. And then the final sports lecture in this series is Compulsory Exercise in School, and that's by Dr. Gavin Ward. So all of those will be on our social media, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and on the university's virtual events page as well. So we look forward to seeing you again. And obviously, if you have enjoyed tonight, please spread the word for us. So thank you very much once again to everybody for coming. I hope you've enjoyed it. And thank you very much to Kath and Kay for supporting us tonight. It was a great lecture. Thank you very much.
Thanks everyone for coming. Thanks Paula for having us.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.